Well, good morning. Got a talkative crew this morning, so I expect lots of comments and discussion and good thoughts. So appreciate everybody being here. We are winding up our class, and we are on lesson 3.7, and this is our last week together. So don't act too excited. Yeah. 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 I get it. I'm not. No. Last week we talked about 6, faith builds worship as worship builds faith, and we talked about how important it is that our faith, really guides and drives our worship. As we've talked about, is a response to God. It's a response to everything that He is and everything that He has done for us. And just a summary, let's look back there just for a moment. And can somebody remind us, maybe to describe the difference between the faith of the Canaanite woman and the faith of Peter when he walked on the water? What was the difference? Yeah, she had a very persistent faith, didn't she? And she had just an exceeding faith that, she knew and believed that Jesus could heal with a word. It didn't require any sort of ritual or action or any particular thing. All he had to do was say the word, and the healing would be done. And she was proven correct in that. What about Peter? What happened to Peter?
He exposed all the things that Jesus had done, and still wavered when he was walking under the water.
Yeah. What happened to his faith in that moment? He lost focus, didn't he? What distracted him? What distracted his faith? Yeah, the wind and the waves, right? And do we have faith in the power of nature? Absolutely. I think anybody who's stood in the ocean and tried to, stand against a wave coming in, there's a lot of power there. Against a strong wind, whatever the case may be, there's a lot of power in nature. Who created nature? Who controls all those things? God does. And so Peter, in that moment, lost focus on that. His faith lost focus on that. And we start to look with our physical eyes instead of our spiritual eyes, we can lose our focus on what's important. We can lose our focus and our understanding. And tying that back to our worship, and thinking back about our lesson about worshiping God in despair, worshiping God in difficult times. Where is our focus in those moments? Where is our hope lying? Are we trying to rely on our own wisdom, our own ideas to get through those things, or are we really completely giving ourselves over, really and completely giving ourselves up to His will, and trusting that He is able and willing to deliver us from those difficulties, whether that be. All right. Lesson 3.7. Lord Lord your God with what? Now everybody's talking real quiet all of a sudden. Before we started class, it was just we couldn't hear each other over each other. So let's raise the voices up a little bit.
Heart, soul, mind.
There you go. Heart, soul, and mind. This is something that we have referenced a little bit throughout the class. What is this passage in Deuteronomy called? Anybody remember? The Shema. Yeah. This was a very important text to the Hebrews. Still is, and it's a sort of a devotional text to God and to His Word, and reminding them of how they ought to live and how they ought to teach one another and their families. And so we're going to look at that this morning and think about how that can guide our worship. What if God measured everything about our service to Him, our love, our faith, our devotion to Him, purely based on our worship? How do we feel about that? How would that reflect on us? Would He speak of us the way that He spoke of David? If the only proof of our love for God, if the only evidence that could be given for our faith in God was the effort that we praise, would there be enough there to convict us? That's a humbling thought, a humbling question, and something that I think we need to reflect on. Do we really put the effort into praise that God is worthy of? And so when we read this phrase, to love God with all your heart, soul, and might, are we doing that? Well, I think in order to answer that question, we're going to have to make sure we understand what those terms mean. So we're going to look at that. But this question, of what does our worship really demonstrate about our faith, about our service to God, it reminds us that our worship is often diminished by things that distract us. We've talked a lot in this class about the things that get in the way, the things that distract us, not only here in the corporate service, but in our daily lives. Our lives should be filled with worship, but we are so distracted by just everything going on in our world, in our busy lives. We often get distracted. We often find our worship is diminished by pride. Sometimes we're too prideful to humble ourselves in the way that we ought to. And maybe our worship is diminished by, for lack of a better word, cynicism. That maybe we get in a place where we feel like God isn't hearing us, that, we talked about that feeling of being far away from God, and how do we respond to that? If we're, whatever the case may be, if we're not giving God our best, if we're not really giving Him our all, if we're not honoring Him with all of our heart, soul, and might, we need to sit with that. We need to think about that and understand the importance of that. The book of Deuteronomy is a very interesting book, and this is where the Shema comes from. And let's turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 6. And these are words of Moses, Deuteronomy chapter 6, and beginning in verse 4 there. These words of Moses, and you think about Moses. Did Moses enter the promised land? No, he didn't get to. Because of his sin, he didn't get to enter the promised land. And yet, these beautiful, amazing words and amazing devotion to God still being poured out from him should give us some pause as well. And there's an urgency to what he's saying here. He knows that the people are going to enter the land and they're going to have a lot of work ahead of them, and there's going to be a lot of things that are going to distract them. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to have the opportunity, and of course we have the benefit of hindsight of knowing that they did distract the people of Israel from God. But he's trying to get them to understand what it's going to require for them to serve the Lord. Deuteronomy chapter 6, and somebody read verses 4 through 9 for us.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates.
Okay. So this is the Shema, and he goes on and talks about the things that are going to come once they take the land, and he even says there in verses 10 and 11, he talks about all the good things that they're going to receive in this land, the great and good cities that you did not build, houses full of all good things to eat that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees you didn't plant. He says, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Moses is clearly concerned about the people just as they did in the wilderness. What happened as soon as they got out of Egypt, and things got just the least little bit difficult. What happened? Yeah, they're like, well, we had plenty to eat back there in Egypt. I mean, sure, we were slaves and in bondage and worked 27 hours a day, but, so Moses knew what was going to happen. And so he gives them these, whether you want to call them, well, he says these words that I command you. He's giving them sort of a commandment here of how to maintain their focus. The word Shema is Hebrew for listen. And that's the first thing he says is, hear, O Israel. Hear this warning that I'm giving you. Heed these words that I'm telling you, because I know what's going to come. And why is he warning them against, whether they realize it or not? Why is he giving them all these physical, tangible things that they ought to do to remember God and to teach their children and their families about God? Why is he giving them all these kind of specific things, do you think, to do to remember God and his word? All right, so they won't be forget. But what would cause them to forget him? What are they going to deal with when they come into this land? Yeah, there's going to be a lot of things to distract them. There's going to be a lot of pagan gods, and of course, we know the struggle that they had in trying to follow God and his commands to drive out these people, destroy all these idols, get rid of all this stuff, and purify this land. God wanted his people to be pure. He wanted them to set aside every worldly thing and push all these idols and all these pagan peoples out of the land. Did they do it? No, they didn't. They couldn't bring themselves to just completely devote themselves to God in that way. But I think that's really what Moses is getting at, is that they have to, in that word there in verse 7, you shall teach them diligently to your children. The diligence that they were going to have in order to maintain the faith, not only today, but throughout the generations that were to come. Moses was being very forward-looking here and saying that, maybe your faith is strong today, and maybe this will last for now, but if we're not diligent, if we're not with all of our might doing everything we can to instill the importance of these values this faith and devotion to God in generation after generation, then it's not going to last. And so this was and is very foundational to Judaism, but this same idea is very important to us as Christians. And it's easy for us to say, well, we don't deal with a lot of paganism today. We don't know a lot of people who go to some temple and worship, some little statuette of somebody. But what's the difference in what they dealt with and what we deal with? Not much, no. And if anything, if maybe it's worse, because it's not such a tangible thing. We worship intangible things, and we are filled with influence. All they had to do to get rid of these influences was do what God commanded and drive out all these people, and we are surrounded by influences. We have so much technology and communication and every idea in the world at our fingertips. And when you think about especially our young people and the access that they have to knowledge, which is a wonderful thing when used and guided properly, because we also have access to every resource for Bible study and for understanding God's Word that you could possibly think of. I mean, we can carry on this little tablet every translation of the Bible in every language and any kind of resource you want to think about to guide our study. But it all comes back to the first three words of this: hear, O Israel. If we're not willing to hear, if we're not willing to listen, and we're not willing to heed the warning here that we have to be diligent, that we have to be devoted, then we are going to wrestle with the gods and the idols and the idolatry of this world. We do wrestle with all the things that he talks about here in the Shema. We wrestle with diligence. We wrestle with training generations of Christians to come. We wrestle with spending time in our homes in Bible study. When we walk in the way, okay, change that to drive down the road. We're not even sweating as we travel. When you lie down and when you rise, you compare the comfort and ease that we have in our lives now compared to Moses' day. What possible excuse could we have for not being diligent with these things when we do have it so easy? When we don't have to walk several miles to go fetch water and things like that. It says, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And we talked about earlier, this is something that is taken very literally. And I don't think that that's really the point of even what he's saying here. I mean, certainly that can be perhaps a tool, a benefit. We see people who will wear symbols, who will put, maybe you put your phone screen as a Bible verse or some image that reminds you of God and His love, whatever it may be. And that's all good and well. But if those signs and those frontlets in our eyes, if those things aren't penetrating our hearts, if they're not penetrating our minds, if the Word is not getting into our brains and our lives, then all those things are worthless. And so nailing a little box with the Torah scroll on our door is not helpful if we're not reading it, if we're not ingesting it. Let's look at these words: heart, soul, and might. I'll understand what they mean. The Hebrew word for heart is lebab. Did anybody kind of look at any other definitions or what this word how it's defined? No? Okay. Well, so when somebody says, your heart, what do we think of? Okay, we think about our mind, right? We understand that it's not talking about our da-dun-da-dun blood pumper. That's the sound it makes, right? Da-dun-da-dun. Anyway. It's not just, sometimes we equate it with emotion. And there's an element of that to it, obviously, but it's more than that. It's the inner part of us. It's our conscience, it's our understanding, our senses, the things that we have affection for, the things that we might say we have a heart for, the things that we care about, that we're passionate about. It's emotion. Emotion plus is maybe the way to think about it, because we can be emotional. We can have emotional responses to movies and TV shows and music and things like that, but they're not. Those are kind of short acting emotions, right? They kind of dissipate pretty quickly. But the things that really come from our heart are much, much more durable. And so when we love God with the heart, what does that mean? What does it mean to love God with all of your heart? Okay? Yeah. Expound on that a little bit, if you would.
Well, I'm going with what's in the book here, really. It's all about your conscience, understanding, the senses, the affection that you show, the love that you show toward God.
Yeah. And it's that response that we've talked about, because God has loved us. We know that because He first loved us, we love Him, and everything that we understand about love comes from that. And so our heart should be filled with godly love, with the kind of love that He had for us. And it is a complete, it's certainly an emotional understanding of God, but it's rooted in knowledge. It's rooted in knowing who He is and what He's done, and understanding that it's sort of hard to think about, because it's understanding that we can't possibly understand how deep His love is, how great His might and majesty is, but knowing that is unknowable should propel us all the more to love Him. Let's turn over to 1 John chapter 4. And I think we've looked at this some in the past. We'll skip around to a couple verses here, but 1 John chapter 4 and verse 7, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God." Again, that idea that this is rooted in knowledge. In order to understand love, in order to have love, we have to know God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this love that God was made manifest among us, that God sent His only Son into the world that we might live through Him. God is the source. He is the creator of everything, including love. And so our understanding and everything that really comes out of our heart from love is all pointing to God. And God's love casts out fear from us. Our love is responding to His love. And so when we are abiding in Him, when we are serving Him and understanding who He is, then our hearts are going to be filled not just with emotion, not just with some sort of an emotional response, but with a deep, conscious understanding of who God is, of what He's done, and what we owe Him. The second thing there is our soul. And the Hebrew word for soul is nephesh. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that exactly right, but nephesh. When people talk about their soul, what do we think of? Where's your soul at, Nathan? Where's it at? Can you point to it? We kind of know our hearts like right around here somewhere, and we've got some lungs in here, and we know where a lot of stuff is, but we can't really point to the soul, can we? Can't really find it on an X-ray. But do we know what it is? Do we have an understanding of it? At least a little bit. What's your soul? Okay. Yeah. We know it's something that outlasts this physical body, right? And we kind of have an understanding that it's what gives us life. And not just in the sense of, biological processes, but life, eternal life, our personhood, however you want to say that, our animate breath. In biblical literature, it's also translated as life, person, creature. It's an all-encompassing concept. And the idea here being that if we're going to serve God with all of our soul, if our soul is sort of this all-encompassing concept of our being, that means that we are to give God our very being. When we think about the idea of being devoted to God and devoting our souls to God, there's nothing that's excluded from that. There's nothing that we can do. There's nothing that we can think or say or anything about our consciousness that should be excluded from service to God. The ninth Psalm, a Psalm of David here in the first two verses, he says, "I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart. I will recount all of your wonderful deeds. I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praise to your name, O Most High." This Psalm of David and the praise and worship that he offered to God demonstrates to us, that how we need to be engaged with God in every aspect. Yes, our emotions should be involved. Our understanding should be involved. Our exultation, singing, gladness, all that we have, all of our emotions, all of our faculties need to be focused on worshiping God. It's not something that we can, sort of silo into, this part of my brain is focused on this, but, I'm also thinking about what I got to do this afternoon. It's a very focused and very complete thing that we're doing. Mm-hmm.
Saw a video last week, kind of reminds me of what we're talking about here. It was kind of a zoomed in view of the moment that conception happens when the eggs fertilize. There's like this flash of light that occurs. So to me, that's when God's given us the gift of life when we're conceived inside of our mother. And at least when I look at the definition here of nefesh, that can actually be assigned to animals too. Of course, the difference being that we have understanding that God's given us. That's what kind of separates us from animals. But to me, that means if we're serving Him, loving Him with all our nefesh, all our life that He's, the gift of life that He's given us, with it should penetrate through our entire being. I mean, I don't know. That's just something I was thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, no, that's a great thought there. That understanding that God gave us our life. Without Him, without Him creating us and giving us the ability to live, then we don't exist. And so, how can we not owe all of that to Him and devote all of that to Him if we have that understanding? Absolutely. And then the last thing there is might. The Hebrew word is miad. And it appears in the Bible quite often. The book says at least nearly 300 times, meaning very greatly or exceedingly. What do we think of when we think of might? Pardon? Yeah, we think of strength, right? And when we think of strength, when we think of might, a lot of times we're thinking about, brawn. We're thinking about muscles and physical force, physical will. Is that what we're talking about here? Maybe in a sense, maybe in some degree, but I think we're talking about much, much more than that. What is the kind of might that we're speaking about here? Yeah. Yeah, do I? Yeah, conviction. Ooh, I like that. Yeah. Yeah, it's taking all the things that we just talked about. It's taking the heart and the soul, which, if our heart and our soul are completely engaged and involved in serving God, what more can we do than that? And that's sort of what this idea is getting at. It's that idea, we tell people, in sports or whatever, give 110% effort, which we know is mathematically, Stacy, you're a math teacher, can we give 110% effort? Technically? No. But this idea says that we can. That there's always the effort that we can give. And with the understanding, can we do anything? Can we do anything to make ourselves worthy of God? No. Can we do anything to make ourselves worthy of salvation? Not even close. Should we be motivated to try? Absolutely. Absolutely, we should. With all your strength, with all your effort, with everything you can muster, not allowing so easily things to distract us, not allowing so easily ourselves to get discouraged. Are we going to get discouraged? Absolutely. Are we going to have difficult days? Absolutely. But where are we going to find the courage, to find the strength to carry on, to continue to serve God? Well, it's going to be in the same place that the apostles found it when they were imprisoned, when they were being persecuted, when they were being chased out of cities by their own brethren for teaching about Christ. We're going to find it in that understanding of who God is, and that understanding of what Jesus did for us on the cross. And with that diligence that Moses spoke about, not thinking about, because that diligence that he was talking about, was that for themselves? No, that diligence was for the generations to come, not just them alone. That diligence was to maintain the faith, to maintain the unity of the faith that they had for generations to come, by teaching their children, by teaching their families, by teaching one another, by strengthening and encouraging one another, so that God's people would perpetuate. And we need to have that same focus. It's not just for me, but it's so the church can continue on. It's so that God's kingdom can continue on and expanding and teaching and saving lost souls, not only here and now, but throughout the world and throughout the generations. And you consider the fact that here we are a couple thousand years after Jesus was on the earth. You think about all the people who had to maintain the faith, all the people and the things that they suffered in order that we would have the Bible in different languages, the Bible in the printed word. I'm quite certain that there have been moments in history where that came into question. Whether or not this was going to be, you think about all the things that are lost to history, and yet God's Word has endured. And certainly we know that God has a hand in that, that he ensures that. But he uses people of faith, just as he used people of faith in the Old Testament. When we look at all the people in Jesus' lineage, how many unlikely characters are there in Jesus' family history? And so God uses us to do His will in spite of all of our flaws and shortcomings.
Well, even Moses himself was a testament to the fact that in spite of what you do right, you can do wrong, and things still continued through Caleb and Joshua. They still entered the promised land, even though Moses failed them as a leader. They still believed in God after they saw, I'm sure, the things that He did and preserved them in the wilderness for 40 years. But anyway, some of the more renowned people who were leaders of God's people in the early days failed miserably in some ways.
Absolutely. We talk about David all the time. Think about the horrible things that David did in his time as king, and yet how did God describe him? A man after His own heart. God loves to use flawed people to demonstrate His might and majesty, because that's what ultimately it comes down to, is giving ourselves over to Him and allowing Him to work. 2 Peter 1 verse 10 says, "Therefore, brothers, be all the more diligent to confirm your calling and election, for if you practice these qualities, you will never fall." Again, that idea of diligence. And this passage here, this short passage, is like the Shema condensed into one sentence. Be diligent to make your calling and election sure. Practice these qualities. What does that mean, to practice these qualities? He's talking about confirming your calling and election, adding, you go back to all the things he talked about there, and the building up of faith through virtue and knowledge, self-control, steadfastness, godliness, brotherly affection, and love. If we practice all these qualities, well, the only way for us to really understand those things are to understand God. If the ultimate goal is love, then we've got to understand God. That means we've got to know His Word. That means we've got to be practicing our devotion, our worship, our understanding of who He is. And so the diligence that we can muster in that is what's going to make the difference. 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 14, there at the end of the book, he says, "Therefore, beloved, since you are waiting for these, be diligent to be found by Him without spot or blemish and at peace." Again, using that idea of diligence, giving our best effort, our strongest effort, in order to, as it says there, to be found perfect in His eyes. And it's not, again, by our works, by our deeds, by anything that we can do that will be found perfect, but it's allowing Him to perfect us that can make that happen.
You know that word neo, is that how you pronounce it?
Sure. Whatever you like.
Well, I've got the definition, a word that you really don't think of when you read that, that's in the definition. Of course, you have to be talking about this in context, but the word loud or louder is in that definition.
Okay? Yeah, and what creates loudness is just when we're talking or singing or whatever, is just more effort. Yeah.
I think that applies to our love and praising God and certainly our singing.
Yeah, if people found our faith to be a little bit loud, I think there are a lot worse things that could be said about us. Absolutely. So which of these three do you think that we struggle the most with? Heart, soul, might? Which one of those is the biggest struggle, do you think? Pardon? Okay. Yeah. Anybody have a... She said might.
I might say heart, because to me, conscience, that means, that weaves in and out of your very fiber sometimes. It's easy to get distracted by the world and lose focus.
Yeah. My answer is D, all of the above. But I think it's day to day. I think there are some days when, we really got maybe one of the three. But it's probably a lot rarer than we'd like to admit that we got them all three wrapped up. And I think it's probably, there are days when maybe we've really got our heart and our soul focused, but we're just not maybe putting the effort we ought to. And maybe there's days when we're just really gung ho and we're really putting the effort in, but there's something missing. There's something that we're struggling with, and maybe the reality is that they're all three so closely tied together that it doesn't really matter which one is which, because if they're not all pulling together, then they're all three going to be lacking. But it's certainly something worth thinking about and spending some time examining ourselves and kind of taking stock of where we're at spiritually. So what does this look like practically? I think we need to, make some commitments to ourselves, to God, to our families even, to the church, all those things, that we're going to worship God with all of our soul, that we're going to resist the temptation to put worship in a box, and put, things of God in a box on Sunday or Wednesday. Sometimes this is the box that we put it in. But we have the opportunity, we have the responsibility to talk about God all the time, to talk about spiritual things all the time, to use the opportunities that God gives us to talk to our kids, to talk to our families, to talk to our friends, our co-workers, everyone that we encounter. We can give them a word and encourage them. Yeah, it might be a little loud, and that's okay. We need to worship God with all of our heart, and that means committing to real Bible study. I know a lot of the ladies here are doing that scripture journal, and I can see the benefit in that, and the great devotion that it requires in order to keep up with that. Not just, I'm going to read a passage and let that be it. That's fine to do. That's a great thing to do. But if we're not stopping and really studying, really seeking, really digging, I think all of us have experienced that at some point in time, that you finally dug into a story, a passage, a word, and realized, I never understood this. I've read this 1,000 times and I never understood it until now. And that's what real Bible study is finding the deep meanings, and the hidden things that are in the Scripture for those who are seeking. And then finally, worshiping God with all of our might. And that means being prepared to enter worship, preparing our minds, being diligent to devote ourselves to God, pushing out distractions, and really being present in our worship. So, thank you guys.